Very much, Mr. Chairman. I like that introduction. I think to be warned that Marxism is not a monolithic unity is very salutary. There are indeed many different tendencies and varieties of Marxism, and that's a good thing. Although naturally representing one tendency, I don't think all the others are as good, but that's a different matter. My subject tonight, the future of capitalism. And I suppose after the events of the past year, there can be very little doubt that the foreseeable future, which could be taken to mean something like the next 4 or 5 decades, beyond that, it's not much use trying to foresee. And certainly well into the 21st century, the future belongs to capitalism. Such a perspective is relatively new. For most of this century, it was by no means clear that capitalism would survive into the third millennium. The great revolutions of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Chinese of 1949, each preceded and in a real sense caused by a devastating world war, took approximately a third of the world's population and territory out of the capitalist system. The leaders of these revolutions had every intention of creating a new social system along lines adumbrated but never elaborated by Karl Marx in the 19th century. For reasons which we obviously haven't got time to go into here, these intentions were not realized. The socialist society envisaged by Marx was a workers' democracy, and none of the post-revolutionary countries of the 20th century, despite frequent claims to the contrary, succeeded in reaching that goal. Still, these post-revolutionary societies were definitely not capitalist, and they provided an alternative model of development with impressive achievements to its credit and features of great appeal to the masses of exploited and impoverished people in what now is generally called the Third World. For a long time, the contest between capitalism and its upstart post-revolutionary rival seemed to be close and of uncertain outcome. But as the events of 1989-90 demonstrated, this was an illusion. Capitalism, older, more deeply rooted, vastly richer, and in control of most of the world's natural resources, had much more lasting power, and given the will to use it, which always existed, was bound to win in the long run. As it happened, the long run ended in 1990. Now, against this background, the importance of our subject, the future of capitalism, is self-evident. There are those, very vocal these days, who believe that capitalism, having outlasted its revolutionary rival, will have plain sailing from now on. Yet history tells a very different story. As a going concern, capitalism can be traced back some 500 years to the time when the New World was opened up for exploitation by the maritime explorers, freebooters, and traders of Western Europe. Next year, as you know, we're going to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the most famous of those freebooters and exploiters and criminals. Christopher Columbus. Can't find my place. From that time on, the expansion was continuous, and the system evolved into the worldwide industrial trading and financial economy we know today. But at no time in the course of this 500-year history was there anything even approaching plain sailing. The reasons for this are clear. Capitalism, by its very nature, is extremely dynamic and expansionist. It is loaded with contradictions and conflicts, both within itself, class antagonisms, and a whole bunch of other types of antagonisms, and also in relation to its pre-capitalist or non-capitalist environments. Wars of conquest and internecine wars for supremacy. These conflicts take many forms, including economic crises and wars both small and large. The 20th century, that is the recent past, excuse me, has experienced three particularly severe and pervasive crises of capitalism. The First World War, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the Second World War. What reason is there to believe that the leopard has changed its spots, that 500 turbulent and crisis-ridden years will now all of a sudden give way to a prolonged period of economic progress and international peace? Last year at this time, very recently in other words, just such a perspective seemed entirely reasonable to many people. The Cold War was over, so it was thought. The economic expansion that began back in 1983 was in a record-breaking 8th year. The end of history, at least the bad old history of the last half millennium, had arrived. A new era of sustained peace and prosperity was dawning. Alas for illusions. Now, only a year later, a recession is underway which is all but unanimously expected to be the most serious since the Second World War, and which a growing minority believes will develop into a full-fledged depression. At the very same time, war has erupted in the Middle East that threatens to involve the major powers and to bring about untold damage and destruction to the global economy. A more dramatic change in the short span of 1 year would be hard to imagine. So I think we are safe in dropping the idea of a new capitalist era of peace and prosperity. Question is, what is the realistic outlook for capitalism as we approach the end of the 20th century? To answer this question, we must remind ourselves of the fundamental characteristics of capitalism and review the way it has functioned in the period since the Second World War. This should give us a basis for projecting the broad outlines of a likely future course of development. Capitalism, as noted earlier, is by nature an expanding economy. The driving force is the process of capital accumulation. Capitalist society is divided into two basic classes: those who own the means of production and other forms of wealth, land, stocks and bonds, certificates of deposit, etc. And, on the other hand, those who live off their wages and salaries and own little, except, if they are lucky, the houses they live in and the cars they move in. The former class, the capitalists, consumes part of their incomes, typically a smaller share the larger the income, and saves the rest with a view to increasing its wealth. The latter, the working class, which comprises some 75 to 80% of the economically active population in the advanced capitalist countries, normally consume their entire incomes, and many are habitually in debt from consuming even more. When the system is working smoothly, as it is assumed to do in the textbooks, the savings of the capitalists are invested in additional means of production, thus increasing their own wealth and society's capacity to turn out goods and services. If the incomes of the workers increase sufficiently to enable them to buy the growing output of goods and services, all will be well. The economy will grow, the capitalists will get richer, and society's standard of living will rise. On the whole, this process describes what actually happened in the advanced capitalist countries from the time of the Industrial Revolution to our own time. But it was never as smooth as the textbooks presented it. From the beginning, there were the ups and downs of the business cycle with its periodic panics and depressions. These were recurring reminders that there are no automatic mechanisms within the system to maintain a proper and sustainable balance among the flows of savings, investment, and income. There was always a tendency for capitalists to save too much and for workers' incomes to rise too little to justify the increase in investments that would be needed to keep the economy growing at its full capacity. In the early days of capitalism, this drag factor, as I may call it, manifested itself in periodic breakdowns. Later, as the system matured, it became more powerful, operating in all phases of the cycle and giving rise to the phenomenon that has come to be known in recent decades as stagnation. What I have just been discussing can be called the logic of capitalism. It deals with the interrelations of a few key variables: consumption, investment, savings. But of course, there are many other relevant factors that are not part of this logic that play an important role in determining the historical outcome. For example, the historical context of a given period, the impact of science and technology, and perhaps most significant, wars, including their preparation and their aftermaths. All of these have to be factored in to get a realistic understanding of the actual historical trajectory of capitalism and its likely future. Still, the logic of the system is crucial, and in the final analysis, may be said to be determining. Capitalism's heyday was the 19th century, or more precisely, the century between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, that is 1814 to 1914. For all its troubles and faults, the system was a success for the rich countries that dominated it worldwide and their privileged citizens, though not for its third world underbelly or for the underclass of exploited workers and unemployed in the advanced countries themselves. Always, capitalism was a success, if it was a success, for a very small minority of mankind. Still, the tendency to stagnation became increasingly evident in the early years of the 20th century and was only interrupted by World War I and its aftermath in the 1920s. But the respite was short-lived. and stagnation returned with a vengeance in the 1930s. The Great Depression of that decade was by far the deepest and the longest experienced up to that time. Once again, World War came to the rescue. Between 1939 and 1945, the U.S. gross national product increased by some 75%, and unemployment plunged from 19% of the labor force to less than 2%. And all of this at a time when 11 million people in the most productive age groups were being absorbed into the armed forces. The enormous increase in production and productivity during the Second World War is the most striking proof of the depth of the stagnation that had been achieved before the World War. And the transition from stagnation to full employment and full capacity production was brought about by not the logic of capitalism, but by an external factor, the war. In spite of this astonishing performance of the U.S. economy during the war, the predominant view at the time was that when the war was over, the situation would revert to something like the stagnation of the 30s. This, of course, did not happen. And it is important, very important, to understand why it did not. I don't know all the answers. I don't think anybody does. The problem is a very complicated one, and to my knowledge, no systematic study has ever been devoted to it. I can only give you my own impressions as one who lived through the period and was deeply interested in the events as they transpired. The most important factor, I think, was that World War II never really ended, as earlier wars had ended with settlements and peace treaties and general demobilization of armies and navies. World War II just gradually merged into the Cold War, which in reality included two major regional wars and many smaller ones. There were other factors sustaining the capitalist system in the post-World War II period. But I am convinced that taken all together, they would not have produced a prolonged economic expansion any more than the recovery after the First World War succeeded in prolonging the expansion of that period. It started about 1919 or 20, and it collapsed into the Great Depression barely 10 years later. I think that the decisive role after the Second World War in preventing it from declining in a similar fashion to that followed the First World War was the institution of what has aptly been called a permanent war economy. That started in the late 1940s, and it's still with us in the 1990s. But even the permanent war economy could not stave off stagnation forever. It began to creep back with the winding down of the Vietnam War in the early 70s and became much more marked by the end of the decade. As some of you here will remember, the decade of the 70s ended in a phenomenon which was new at the time, often described as stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation. This set the stage for the Reagan administration's deliberate policy of stepping up the Cold War. The resulting recovery from the recession of 1981-82 was very different from a traditional business cycle upturn, and the ensuing record-breaking expansion, that's 8 years long, peacetime expansion, was entirely dependent on a vast armament buildup financed by deficits of a magnitude never incurred before except in an all-out war situation. And now we know that even this was not enough to stave off a recession which threatens to snowball into the first full-fledged depression since the 1930s. This record of stagnation recurring is, I think, what we need most to internalize, to understand. Prosperity is no longer, as it was considered to be 100 years ago, the normal state of a capitalist economy. The normal state is stagnation. That is, the operation of the economy at a level far below its potential. I already mentioned the performance of World War II as the striking proof of how far that margin between potential and realization actually becomes in a period of stagnation. I believe that a similar situation exists today in that a full utilization of our country's resources, manpower and woman power, and natural resources and capital equipment would, in my opinion, easily lead to an increase in the gross national product of something like 50%, which would be $150 billion. And what you could do with $150 billion, of course, you can imagine yourself. That's annually, you know. And even, you know, in the face of that obvious, I think it's really obvious. I mean, if we had a world war like the Second World War now, it would be possible to expand production on that order of magnitude. And we don't do it. That's the way capitalism operates. It's fundamentally incapable of utilizing the resources at its disposal. Although, given that restriction, of course, it is a very productive, potentially productive system. Now, what does all this tell us about the future of capitalism? First, I think it tells us that the crisis we are now entering is deeper and more threatening than any that has faced the country since the early 1930s. Second, it tells us that the way we got out of that earlier crisis, the war, the Second World War, followed by the permanent war economy, is no longer an available option. It has exhausted its potential. Another world war, quite apart from its effect on economic expansion, would most likely bring the end of civilization as we know it. That's not a sensible option for any ruling class to take if it understands, and I think it does understand, the limits of the military enterprise nowadays. From now on, more war can only make matters worse. That's not necessarily true of small wars, of course, but I mean more massive war on a scale which would bring the utilization of resources up towards its potential. Now here we have to ask a question, and a lot of people think they have the answer. And that is there a reasonable hope of rescue through an old-fashioned capitalist boom powered by a fundamental and earth-shaking technological innovation or set of innovations comparable to the railroad and the automobile in the 19th and early 20th centuries? These were technological changes which revamped the geography of the country. The railroad made possible the opening of the whole country, the building of new cities, the relocation of the population, and all of that not only directly absorbed enormous amounts of capital in the railroads themselves, but probably even more in the buildings and the factories and so on, which resulted from the relocation of economic activity. The automobile had a similar consequence, although directly the automobile industry never absorbed anything like the capital investment that the railroads did. But still, it was the automobile that made possible the suburbanization of the U.S. Population. Prior to the automobile, suburbs were a phenomenon of only a few areas where commuter railroads existed. But with the coming of the automobile, every city in the country was surrounded by suburbs to which the overflow population tended to go, and much of the urban population in the center, the urban centers, spread out into the suburbs. That also was responsible for enormous secondary investments in housing, in office building, in malls, and in roads, and so on and so forth. Now, those two great technological innovations were the basic factors in sustaining a capitalist expansion in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Is there anything like that on the horizon now? Is there anything that could conceivably have a similar effect, pulling this present society or economy out of its doldrums, out of its mire of stagnation? And the answer, I think, is very clearly no. And the reason is not that there isn't a tremendous amount of technological and scientific innovation. There is. There's perhaps more than there has ever been before in history. The electronic revolution, the information revolution, the biological revolution, you hear about all of them every day. And roll them all up into one. And they don't take much capital. And that's a very, very striking difference between the present and the past scientific, technological eras of capitalism. As a matter of fact, as plants wear out and are amortized and funds become available for replacement, nowadays the replacement often is of a kind which uses much less capital than the ones that are being replaced, because automation, improved productivity, and so on, without any particular relocation of population or need for extensive new buildings and so on. And the whole thrust of the newer revolutions, technological and scientific revolutions, is probably capital saving rather than capital using. That was totally the opposite of the great innovations of the past. As a matter of fact, the most capital using or creating innovation of the last 50 years or so, probably you'd never think of it. It's air conditioning, because that made it possible to open up the South and the Southwest to a huge increase in population, which meant new cities, new towns, new office buildings, new factories, a whole new geographical distribution of the population and of economic activity dependent on air conditioning. Well, air conditioning in and of itself is not a big user of capital, of course. But the newer electronic, the computers and the automation, all that kind of, and the information and biological new processes, that doesn't have any such secondary consequences. And there's no reason whatever to suppose. We know this not from pure theory. We know it because that series of revolutions has been in process now for 30, 40 years. And it hasn't created any great capital investment booms. Matter of fact, the situation in this country today is very paradoxical in one sense. More capital investment now is going into financial assets, computers for finance, office buildings, things of that sort, than in manufacturing. Manufacturing does not absorb capital and require investment, which is what capitalism needs in order to, by its own logic, to expand properly. And we just can't count on anything like that. Nobody has come up with even an imagined innovation today which would take the place of the railroad. Before the railroad, the steam engine, of course, was of enormous importance in relocating economic activity and changing its nature. Consequently, secondary and tertiary investment waves. And the railroad in the 19th century and the automobile in the early 20th century. These are all things that nobody can even imagine what would be a replicating factor today. At least I can't, and I haven't seen anybody yet who can. Maybe it'll happen, I don't know. But that's a pretty weak read to lean on. So if it's not possible that we should be saved now by either war, massive war, or by a massive wave of investment from technological and scientific advances, then where do we stand? Let me just sum up the essence of the argument I've been trying to put forward up to this point. As a capitalist economy matures, it generates an increasingly strong tendency to stagnation. Since the 1930s, this tendency has been kept at bay, contained, counteracted by World War II and the subsequent permanent war economy. The latter is now losing its effectiveness, and continued reliance on it will almost certainly be counterproductive. No salvation can be expected from a technologically based investments explosion. We have therefore reached what is, in effect, a dead end. But, and this is the big but, this does not mean that capitalism is going to collapse or disappear. Social systems don't do that. They hang on until they're overthrown. And throughout history, many deeply stagnant societies have survived for long periods, often for centuries. And it can certainly happen again. Nor does it mean that capitalism is in any imminent danger of being overthrown. Not at any rate in its industrially developed metropolitan centers, like the countries of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the club of 21 advanced capitalist countries. There's no likelihood, no sign of any significant revolutionary movements capable of overthrowing capitalism in its bastions of strength. That's not true of the third world. It's not true of many of the poorer, underdeveloped countries, where revolutions do occur from time to time, and there's no saying that they can't at some time succeed. Matter of fact, it's conceivable that that some of these underdeveloped countries will have a revolution. Let's say India or Brazil, which is so big and so difficult to control that the advanced capitalist countries will not be able to intervene and prevent them from achieving a revolutionary solution to their problems. I don't say it's likely in any near future, but it's not inconceivable. However, I think it is inconceivable for a long time to come that there should be revolutions in the advanced countries themselves. Now, I'm not going to give you an answer as to what happens if we have a period of prolonged stagnation, deepening stagnation, which is what I think is most likely. Maybe there will be another world war. Maybe they'll have a fling at it and see if it works. I don't think it'll work next time. I think that could be the end. And I don't think that it's likely. I think probably they'll have to endure the chronic crisis rather than flee forward in such a crazy way. Although what's happening in the Gulf right now leads me once in a while to wonder whether it makes any sense to attribute any rationality to what's going on and what will be going on as the situation deteriorates. I don't know what the consequences of a prolonged period, decade-long period of stagnation will be. I can envisage its being very devastating. What's already happening in this country, in the kind of stagnation we've had in the last 3 decades, the deterioration of our infrastructure, the rotting of the inner cities, the social pathologies which are growing up all around us and which seem to have no solution whatever. I don't know what continuation of that kind of situation may imply. Certainly nothing good. But that seems to me, I'm sorry to say, to be the realistic prospect of what we have to look forward to. If that's true, I would say it's time that more of us should begin to think seriously about questioning the logic of capitalism, whether you have to have these huge external impacts of these huge explosions internally of investment in order to keep an economy going. Manifestly, you don't. On paper, it's easy enough to devise a system in which infinite growth is absolutely not necessary, in which resources can be deployed in such a way as to raise standards of living for the mass of the people, which would require an enormous amount of utilization of resources, of course, and which would enable us to do some other things, like checking environmental deterioration, building up the environment again, which, if capitalism lasts long enough, of course, is going to do us all under anyway. Because I don't know any serious person who thinks that capitalism as it functions today can do anything in, let's say, 100 or 200 years but destroy the environment which civilized life needs to exist on this earth. But in the meantime, we just don't know what forms this deterioration is going to take, and of course we don't know how long it's going to take, and we're going to have to, I think seriously about whether there aren't other ways out of the dilemma which can be beneficial all around. Now, since the theme of this conference is Eastern Europe and the world in transition, I suppose I should conclude by a few remarks on the prospects of the Eastern European countries that are now looking forward to joining the global capitalist system as a remedy for their troubles. It seems very ironical that a system that is in some ways terrible shape, like capitalism, should be looked to as worth joining. And I think that experience will show that it is not worth joining, that the prospect of the countries which, like Eastern Europe, and apparently now including the Soviet Union, not China as yet, but maybe China to come, the prospects of those countries, if they try to join the world capitalist system, as they seem determined to do, will be a disaster for them. We know what happens to weak countries in a capitalist system dominated by strong countries. We can see it all through the third world. We know what it's like in Africa and Latin America. I would say quite simply, if you want to know what's going to happen to capitalist Poland, or capitalist Hungary, or capitalist Czechoslovakia, have a look at Mexico, have a look at Latin America, where the unemployment is upwards of 30, 40, 50% of the labor force, where the pollution is even worse than it was in the, quote, so-called socialist period in Eastern Europe, and where standards of living in the last decade have been going down steadily, and real wages have probably lost half their purchasing power in that period. That's what's in store for any weak country, and they're all very weak, the Eastern European countries, that joins the capitalist system and opens it up to the exploitation of capital. Of course, you can't tell the people there, particularly the experts, the social scientists, the economists, who are so gung-ho to get going with capitalism and see it as their personal savior, even if they have never thought through the problem for what it means for their countries. You can't tell them, they'll have to learn the hard way. And I think they will learn the hard way much more rapidly than now seems likely. There are already plenty of indications that that's going to happen.